worries me is the hyper-focus on the small Jewish state that is at least trying, while ignoring the surrounding states who have run out most all of their Jews. And thanks for the $10, Schuperman. I really appreciate it.
Let me take a first crack at it, and then Ken. One is that I'm just thinking of some of those states. You know, Syria was under severe international sanctions. It was pretty much blown to pieces, largely thanks to its own violent government. Iraq was invaded by an international coalition. You know, in other words, Middle Eastern states that violate human rights, that behave badly, you know, there is a price to pay. It is true that Israel attracts more attention. That's true. I mean, Israel does attract a lot of attention in the world. And for people who are close to Israel, I can just tell you one thing. It's never going to end. It's never going to end. And anti-Semitism is part of it, but it is a small part of the story. It is, if the Jewish state had been founded in Tierra del Fuego, it may have been different, but it's in Palestine. It is in the Holy Land. It is in an area. You talk about location, location, location. Okay, and it's a state that the circumstances of its creation, the circumstances of its continued existence are unique. And that's just not going to end. And it is true that Israel is going to get criticized for its actions more, largely because of its connections to the Western world. There are more Western journalists stationed in Jerusalem, I think, than the entire Middle East put together. You know, everybody wants to hang out at the American Colony Hotel. They're maybe not as eager to go hang out in Baghdad. That's just not going to change. And I think it's important to understand when anti-Semitism is a factor behind that and when it's not. Anyway.
Yeah, and I agree with Derek. It's obviously the center of the three major faiths, so everybody has a focus on it. And the other thing that makes it a hot button issue is, as Derek was pointing out, it's sort of unique in the way that you have two strong narratives of national self-expression that are competing and possibly irreconcilable with each other, and that's going to make it a constant focus with people who care on one side or the other. So, I don't see it as anti-Semitism because it's disproportionate. There are certainly times where some of its focus could be anti-Semitic. One can raise questions about how some things in the Human Rights Council and other types of bodies that are supposed to look at global things disproportionately look at Israel and some of the things that are said there and make that case. But just in terms of general focus, I agree with Derek. It's going to be an important part of the world for Jews and non-Jews, for as long as there is in Israel.
Yeah, just to build on that. Wait, why am I hearing an echo? Okay. Just to build on that. I agree that we're not going to change the disproportionate attention Israel gets for many reasons. And I think if we want Israel to not get disproportionate amount of attention, we should focus on fixing the problems that are causing Israel to get disproportionate amount of attention. And I don't think it's true to say Israel's at least trying. One of my biggest critiques of Israel is that they have done very little to change an unsustainable and immoral status quo the past decade plus. And the critique of Israel goes way farther back than just a decade. I think we're not trying nearly hard enough. And me as an Israeli, someone who loves Israel, I want to see Israel improve. And I know that in improving Israel as a nation, that's the single best way to stop the disproportionate amount of attention. And it'll just make the country better in general, right?
Yeah, although one could argue, look, there are some people who are anti-Zionists or critical of Israel, no matter what Israel does. There is, a deep-seated what's called supersessionism in Christian theology, that the Christians somehow replace the Jews. And there are people who really hold on to this and who believe that there's just something fundamentally wrong with Jews having a sovereign state. And there's some people who are going to just think that no matter what. The other issue is, and I'm speaking now as a kind of a part-time international relations scholar, if Israel were the size of Ukraine, and if Israel had 150 million people, it might be able to act in a way that it can't. I'm not talking about morality now. I'm talking about just cold, hard pragmatism. Israel is actually a very small country with a small population. And yes, it has a strong army and it has nuclear capability. We all know what Israel can do and does. But at the end of the day, the project to maintain the occupation, the project to maintain Israel as it's been headed, particularly in the last 15 years, is not sustainable. And you never know when the crash is going to come. It's like the crash that brought down the Soviet Union. All the Sovietologists were taken by surprise. Just a few weeks before this latest round of violence in Gaza and within Israel, I was talking to my class on war in the modern world that, wow, things in Israel seem to have calmed down. And I said to them, for the moment, you never know when the next thing is going to happen. It's just not sustainable. So I think for those of you who are watching who are not impressed by the moral arguments, although I think they do matter, there's also the pragmatic arguments.